So push and pull factors, right, are really important when we're looking at the migration of people. And this first chapter is pretty much all about that. And so to use some modern examples, right? Houston, what is the push-pull factor here? So for Houston, the pull factor is the economy and jobs, right? If you immigrated here, which a lot of people do, myself included, right? We come in search of economic opportunity. As far as Houston goes, not many people come here on vacation, right? This isn't a vacation hotspot or a tourist hotspot, but people come here for jobs. They come here to work and make money. And what is a push factor for Houston? What would push people out? The weather, hurricanes, right? Um, any types, that kind of thing. So if we look at, just our little area, you can look at those push-pull factors. There's more opportunity, there's more culture here than there is, say, in a small town in Texas. Or it could be there's more diversity. For example, if you live in Vidor, or one of those very infamous small towns where there's a lot of racism and prejudice, you would want to move to a bigger city such as Houston to escape that. Look at it on a national level and something that's happening right now. Why are people leaving Latin America and coming to the United States, especially with the immigration policies we're seeing from this administration? What are the push-pull factors? Well, the push factors are they're fleeing violence, mostly due to unstable government, corrupt governments, gang violence, drug cartels, human trafficking, right? They're fleeing that. They're running away from that. And they are coming north. So even with the change in immigration policies, we'll put it that way, people are coming to the U.S. and seeking political asylum. So if um, for example, what is the pull factor for the U.S.? Even for immigrants, when they know that it's possible they could get separated from their families, it's possible that they could not make it across the border, it's possible their children can get detained. They come because they really have nowhere else to go, right? They're trying to flee that violence, as we talked about, and also they're looking for opportunity. So, before they started kind of detaining families and separated families, the migrant farm workers um, was what was an issue at a certain time. And those were people that just came to the U.S. to make money during the growing season and then went back home. But now, since it is so dangerous to cross the border and it costs so much money, they can't afford to go back home. So they come here and they stay and they send money back home. So these are the reasons people migrate. And a majority of the time, people migrate because their basic needs are not being met. I said a majority of the time, right, when we're talking about large migrations. And basic needs such as food, clothing, shelter, safety, right? People are willing to uproot their lives and move because of that in a global scale. But there are exceptions to that, right? You do have migrations of people seeking religious freedom, right? You have migrations of people that were taken against their will, right? You have the Atlantic slave trade. They were kidnapped and forced migrations. You have forced migrations. So these are all just large movements of people, and we talk about push and pull factors. So what the video is beginning to talk about now is what is causing people to leave Europe. Why did Christopher Columbus and the other European explorers want to go west? Okay, and some of the things that they already talked about were the fact that the Mediterranean trade was controlled by the Islamic Empire, and they called it the Caliphate. And it will become the Ottoman Empire. So they control all of the trade in the Mediterranean. Let me see if I can, I'll pull you up a map real quick. There you go. And this is a problem to a certain extent. Let me share a different screen real quick. Okay, hold on. There you go. Okay. So you see here, this is the Mediterranean, right? And the Europeans, the Spanish are going to be the ones that sponsor Christopher Columbus, right? And so all of this trade along the Mediterranean Sea, which is your major trade hubs, right? Italy, Venice, Greece, um, what will become all the Ottoman Empire over here, the Holy Land, North Africa, the Berbers, all of this is controlled by the Islamic Empire. So if you want to ship goods from Europe, say, to the east, or vice versa, if you want to get goods from the east, you have to go through the Islamic Empire. They also control the Silk Road, which is the overland route from the Holy Land over to the east. And every time you have to transfer or go through different areas, you have to pay a tax. So by the time you get goods from Asia, they're at least twice as expensive as they are to buy in Asia. And again, the Islamic Empire is Islamic. They're not Christian. So for some of the European nations, the Spanish in particular, that was a big deal. They did not care to do business with the Islamic Empire, and they also were spurred on by the Pope, who is in Rome, right, which is in Italy, and they were attempting to bypass the Islamic Empire and hopefully weaken them so that they could retake control of the Holy Land. So there's a monetary reason, there's a religious reason, and I think Christopher Columbus, right? He's looking for fame and glory, and he's just an explorer. This is what he does. He looks forward to this. So he's looking for glory. But why the Spanish monarch? So the Spanish monarch, they're young, right? And Ferdinand and Isabella, which they talked about, they are king. Ferdinand is the king of Aragon in his own right, and Isabella is the queen of Castile in her own right. So when they marry, they become the power couple of the 15th century, and they are a warrior couple. She has a full set of armor for herself. She travels on the road. They conquer all the other smaller principalities of Spain to create the Spanish Empire. And in 1492, they successfully kick out the remaining, what they call Moors, but Muslims in the southern part of Spain, and the Jews. They force them out, or they have to convert if they want to stay. So they've completed like their conquest of Spain, and now they're looking to make a name for themselves. Isabel is also very religious, like almost zealously, right? A zealot. And she even gets a special title from the Pope, calling her the most Catholic, right? And so she's spurred on by this. So her big probably impetus is to spread the Catholic faith. Ferdinand, of course, is looking for more territory and money, and they both want money. Wars are expensive, so they need some extra cash. And they want to establish themselves as a dominant force in Europe because, again, they're young, they're new, and they've just finished conquering all of Spain. In addition, when Christopher Columbus, he goes to several different European countries, and it just happens to be the Spanish that take him up on it. The reason he's having trouble is that everyone does believe that the world is round at the time, right? Nobody is still in the flat earth society. They're aware it's round. However, they think Christopher Columbus has miscalculated the size of the earth. And they're right. He really does. He thinks it's a lot smaller than it is. He's thinking and calculating that he can cross the ocean to India, to East Asia in a matter of weeks, when in actuality it would take several months. And so this is the reason he's having trouble securing money, securing sponsorship. And so Isabel and Ferdinand finally agree, and they give him 3 ships. That is not a big, that is not a lot, and the ships are not very good condition. They basically give him just enough money to make it and get back. And that's exactly what happens, right? And the reason they're not going to spend any more money is A, they're cash poor, and B, they don't know if he's ever going to come back. right? So they're kind of hedging their bets on that. So those are kind of just little things that I wanted to talk about, make sure that we're aware of. And I'll go ahead and play the video. Keep going.
I left the city of Granada on Saturday, the 12th day of May, 1492, and proceeded to Palos, a seaport where I armed 3 vessels very fit for such an enterprise. And having provided us with stores and seamen, I set sail from the port on Friday, the 3rd of August, half an hour before sunrise, and steered for the Canary Islands. Sailed this day 19 leagues, and determined to count less than the true number, that the crew might not be dismayed if the voyage should prove long. At sunset, Martin Alonso called out with great joy from his vessel that he saw land, and demanded of the admiral a reward for his intelligence. Continued their course west till the afternoon, then southwest, and discovered that what they had taken for land was nothing but clouds. Encountered a heavier sea than they had met with before in the whole voyage. The crew in the Pinta saw a cane and a log. They also picked up a stick which appeared to have been carved with an iron tool. The crew of the Nina saw other signs of land, and a stalk loaded with roseberries. The admiral directed them to keep a strict watch upon the forecastle and look out diligently for land, and to him who should first discover it he promised a silken jacket, besides the reward which the king and queen had offered. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the land was discovered at 2 leagues distance.
It's a good thing that they made it when they did. They were getting low on water. They'd been out for a little over 30 days. But of course, it wasn't China or Japan that they reached. They were islands in the West Indies off the coast of North and South America. Indeed, Columbus went to his grave thinking that these islands were very close to China and Japan.
In time, Spanish explorers stopped thinking of the Americas as simply an obstacle en route to Asia. They see it as a potential source of wealth, even greater than their original destination. In fact, except for a portion of South America now known as Brazil, they claim the entire New World for Spain and begin the process of colonization and subjugation.
The Spanish monarchs really didn't have the capacity to fund and direct their own military expeditions, especially on the other side of the Atlantic. They were very dependent upon farming out these operations to essentially private entrepreneurs, military entrepreneurs. So an enterprising gentleman, somebody of military ability and of great ambition, would lobby the crown and try to get a license as an adelantado, which meant that he had the king's permission to go off in some part of the world, seek out other people, conquer them, and benefit from tribute taken from them. But any people conquered would then become part of the Spanish Empire, and the king would receive a share of the plunder and future taxes. And so for the monarchs, this is a low-risk strategy. They don't have much in the way of money. They don't have much in the way of a bureaucracy to manage large expeditions. And it encourages these ambitious young aristocrats who otherwise might be making trouble at home.
Cortez, who was probably the most famous, most successful of conquistadors, said that the Spanish suffered from a disease of the heart that only gold could cure. And that's a far more complicated statement than it appears at first, because it's not just we want money, we want gold, but gold for the 16th century was a point of entry, was an entree into much greater forms of social independence. You could buy land, you could buy status of a certain kind, you could be a gentleman, and that would free you in all kinds of ways.
What surprised them, of course, was the high civilizations they did encounter in the Western Hemisphere. The first major one they hit were the Aztecs.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what he just said, right? So the conquistadors, or the adelantados, is what they call them. These are going to be usually they're going to be of noble families or enterprising military men. And what they are doing is trying to make a name for themselves. And this kind of goes back to one of those push-pull factors that we were talking about. So the Spanish, as well as most European countries, are still kind of operating under this idea of feudalism, or an advanced notion of that, which means that you're going to see, um, you know, nobility and aristocracy. So the way it works is you've got the king of the crown, the monarchy at the top, and then you've got their extended relatives, right? So the second, third, and fourth siblings, right? Not the heir to the throne, but the brothers or whatever, and they become dukes. And you can also get titles by serving the crown, but you cannot buy a title, right? It has to be given by the crown. So all the power derives from the monarchy. And the issue there is that there is no entree into nobility. You cannot, there is what they call a glass ceiling. You cannot get up there no matter how hard you work. You're either born into it or you marry into it. And that's it. And most of the time, when you marry into it, that means that you're female, right? Rarely are you going to see a noble family allow their daughter to marry somebody who is not noble, right? In this time period, sons are out to find a bride that's either going to increase their wealth or at least equal the wealth that they already have, and daughters are used to forge alliances and make more money for the family. And they want to get her a good position in a family of equal or greater nobility, right? So this becomes a major kind of system in which there is no upward mobility in the upper classes. And what a lot of these conquistadors or adelantados are these second and third sons. And Europe is operating under a system of what they call primogeniture. And that's just a fancy word for the oldest son gets everything. All the titles, all the land, all the money. So if you're his brother, or sister, whatever, you get nothing, right? The sisters will be married off into noble families that also have money. But what if you're the second, third, or fourth son? That, you're not going to get anything. You're going to be well educated. You're going to serve some time in the military. You're going to be part of the noble class. You're going to be considered a gentleman, but you cannot get a title, right? So this is where you see opportunities or pull factors of the new world for these men, and also for men who are not gentlemen wanting to break into this class of nobility. Because if you go over to the new world, and you're granted, right, your license and to be an adelantado, then you create and you earn yourself a governorship or viceroyalty of, say, New Spain, etc. You can move up, become a gentleman, like she talked about, and get yourself into that class of people, which will open all kinds of doors. And we see this in, say, Francisco Pizarro, who was a very famous conquistador because of his conquering of the Incas. He was poor. He was raised poor, right? And he gained great wealth and fame, and he was able to become, right, part of the noble class. But oddly enough, on a side note, he was assassinated. There was some bad blood, but we'll get into that later. So this is an opportunity for these people who have no opportunities in Europe. So that's why they come. You also have to think about this is full of risk for them as well. There's no guarantee that they're going to find wealth. They could find disease. They could find Native Americans who are not welcoming and happy to see them and kill them on sight. They could come into, they could be killed by a jaguar. There's lots of risk there. They are uprooting their entire life and going. So those are some of the push-pull factors that bring these people over to the new world. All right, push play again.
later the Mayas, and later, of course, the Incas and Chibchas and all kinds of others. And I think ultimately they were rather dazzled by many of these high civilizations.
These great towns and shrines and buildings, rising from the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision from the tale of Amadis. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked whether it was not all a dream. It was all so wonderful that I do not know how to describe this first glimpse of things never heard of, never seen, and never dreamed of before.
And yet, as the conquistadors carve a path across the countryside, they bring destruction to each of the civilizations they encounter.
They are in there to get rich quick, to conquer Indians, subdue them, plunder them. And of course, of doing this, they of course are going to kill a great number of Indians and destroy a great number of Indian towns.
Without warning, the Spanish attacked, slashing at their hands and faces until they had killed all of them. This slaughter in the sacred patio went on for 3 hours. Then the Spaniards burst into the rooms of the temple to kill the others, those who were carrying water, or bringing fodder for the horses, or grinding meal, or sweeping the floor. After night fell, about 12, a terrifying mob of women appeared, carrying torches. They came for their husbands and relatives who lay dead in the porticos. And as the women recognized them then, they threw themselves upon them with great sorrow and grief, and raised such a wailing and crying that it filled one with fear.
No one has the figures of how many people died. We only through the emotions of those oral histories, and they just cry out to us about how horrible it was to watch the people around you die.
The loss of a lot of Indian lives and the destruction of a lot of Indian towns is not in the long-term interest of the Spanish monarch, who wants these people to be taxpayers, and he wants them to convert to Christianity. And their destruction doesn't work to that end. So the Spanish monarch wants to use the conquistadors, but then wants to put them on as short a leash as he can keep them on. And that interest coincides with that of Franciscan missionaries. They are totally dedicated to their mission, which is spreading Christianity. And they're appalled by the violence of the conquistadors. And so they're often lobbying the king to reduce the power of the conquistadors and increase the power of the Franciscan missionaries over these colonial enterprises.
There is an extremely strong religious motivation connected to the Spanish colonization, the missionary effort, all the missionaries who come over. And the Spanish crown itself is, and the Spanish state, is very much tied to the papacy and to a sense of its own religious purpose.
In the native experience, the Franciscans are not always pleasant people to take into their midst. Native peoples who are reeling from conquistador violence often feel they don't have any choice, that they can make the best of a bad situation by accepting Franciscan missionaries in as protectors. But it's always a bargain with prices that Native people must pay.
The idea was to destroy the religions that they encountered and impose Catholicism upon those whom they met. The way it really turned out was that the Catholics found that the best way to get converts was to work out blends of Catholicism, which is why you find in Catholicism in different parts of Latin America to be so different, because the varying Indian influences on the Catholicism. In terms of the governmental structures, of course, they wanted to destroy the major governmental structures, the ones that stood in the way of their conquest. On the other hand, to the degree that they could allow localized government systems to continue to operate as long as they played ball with the new Spanish rulers.
In conquering the Aztecs, the Spanish put themselves at the head of a system in which taking Indian labor was already part of the system. But when the Spanish go to places far from the Valley of Mexico, when they move even beyond New Mexico or into California or onto the Great Plains, they don't find those same kind of Indian peoples in place, and they find it very difficult to import the kind of relations that may work in Mexico or the Andes to those places. So they have to learn to adapt.
Hope sprang eternal that there were lots of Aztec empires and Inca empires, and it's this hope that inspires other Spanish conquistadors to probe northward from Mexico into what is now Florida, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, even along the coast of California, looking for other rich empires. The other and more tangible and immediate incentive is that the Spanish plantations of the Caribbean islands needed labor. The native peoples that they had initially dragooned into doing the work on these plantations and also mines were dying out from their exposure to European diseases and from the stresses of slavery.
The earliest Europeans to make contact with the African continent and to begin to bring Black people into predominantly white communities as lifetime workers or slaves were the Spanish and the Portuguese. And they're doing this in the 15th and 16th centuries. They may even have been doing it earlier than that. They will initially even bring a few of these workers to Europe. So on the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, there is a pattern of Black slavery before these nations lead the rest of the European countries in the conquest and resettlement of what we now call North and South America, West Indies, of course, included. You know, simply put, it's the great labor needs that these Europeans who are in a very dynamic and exciting expansionist phase, they need laborers to help them develop and open up this territory and to make it economically feasible to do all of this settlement.
So to get more slaves, some of these expeditions proceeded along the coast of North America to Florida and the Carolinas to grab people, to haul them back and put them into slavery, to sell them as slaves. And so someone like Ponce de Leon, rather than looking for the fabled Fountain of Youth, was looking for slaves.
During this period, a third group also enters the scene: Spanish settlers.
They're artisans, they're farmers, they're lawyers, they're government officials, and they come in and they want a share of the riches of the Americas. So there ends up being a very heated competition between the secular colonists and the missionaries, who have a common goal of exploiting Indians, but have quite different ways of doing so.
And they're really the only European settlements that succeed in this area for a very, very long time are what I call vampire settlements, because it's Europeans attach themselves to a settled Indian community, such as the Pueblos in New Mexico, and basically live off of Pueblo labor and Pueblo resources. But without those kinds of settled communities, whether they're labor for mines, labor for missions, labor for ranches around there, in fact, the Europeans, by and large, cannot survive in this area. It's going to be an area which is very resistant of imperial control for a very long time.
Throughout the 16th and early 17th centuries, the number of European settlers in Spanish America remains relatively small. The Spanish style of colonization is to exploit the existing native population, not establish large self-contained colonies.
Spanish colonization was very much directed by the crown, by the state, in terms of the people they sent over, obviously the military types, the missionaries. And from the beginning, Spain envisioned a highly elaborate, complicated, bureaucratic state, governed from the top down. They were going to control everything. The fact that they were 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 miles away was a major complication, but it was one that they thought they could overcome. A lot of people begin to see in Spain after its golden age a kind of stagnation of all kinds, and that this affected its colonial control. There were competing interests, and there were also Indian revolts. This is usually not given much attention in American history textbooks, but in the 1680s there was the Pueblo Revolt, which was a significant revolt against Spanish control.
The Pueblo Indians lived in adobe brick villages, which the Spanish called pueblos. And these people didn't know they were all one people. They spoke different languages. They often fought with one another, and they didn't develop a common identity until they had a common set of problems imposed upon them by the intrusion of colonizing Spanish people. And so one of the ironies is that the Pueblo Indians developed improved capacity to communicate with one another where there had previously been linguistic barriers. And this ability to communicate with one another enabled the variety of Pueblo peoples to unite in a rebellion against Spanish rule in 1680. And this drove the Spanish out of New Mexico.
2 centuries of conflict leave their mark on both the Native American and Spanish cultures.
Indian peoples labor under a severe disadvantage. That's their vulnerability to diseases that come in with the Europeans. For Indian peoples, these are what historians call virgin soil epidemics. They have no resistance, and so the death rates can be absolutely horrifying. And these death rates can reach, in some places, 60, 70, 80%. Now, disease itself will not give you that kind of death rate. It'll give you a lot. It'll give you 40 to 50%. But really, to reach the kinds of levels that are taking place here, very often what you need is social disruption. So Indian peoples not only get disease, but they're very often being victimized by slaving, raiding, warfare, which makes it impossible to feed, clothe, and house populations. Nobody's medicine is any good at this time.
Obviously, the diseases were carried by Indians who were fleeing the epidemics. But an additional way that they may have been spread was through the pigs that the Europeans brought with them. They multiplied over the land, and pigs are apparently biologically not dissimilar to human beings. And so some people think they may have been the disease reservoirs. However they were spread, it was devastating to Indian populations.
Not all the interaction between the 2 cultures is quite this disastrous to native populations.
So there's a substantial amount of time in which Indians do coexist independently alongside Europeans. And indeed, many of the cultures of Indian people that we think of as quintessentially Indian couldn't develop until Europeans came because they depend on the horse. And so plains nomadism is just as much a product of this history of contact as anything that happens in the rest of the United States.
Indians increasingly developed a syncretic culture, which adopted elements of Hispanic culture, that adopted elements of Catholicism, of the agricultural practices that the Spanish introduced, and developed a pretty widespread rudimentary understanding of Spanish.
Intermarriage was frequent. Men living alone in a strange land craved companionship. Then, too, there was a desperate need for labor that only the native population could fill. But what of the quest of the Spaniards for new reaches?
Ultimately, they didn't find another Aztec empire, and they found Indians that had a capacity to defend themselves against the slaving expeditions by the Spaniards. So by about 1560 or so, they concluded that the rest of North America wasn't really worth the bother. And they had about all they could handle, and indeed they had very profitable colonies in Mexico and Peru. So they concentrated their resources there, and Spanish settlement concentrated in those places that were very prosperous. Why go live in Florida where there are not Indians who can be readily enslaved and there aren't gold and silver mines when you can settle, and quite happily and prosperously so, in Mexico or in Peru? So the Spanish Empire was immense, it was very rich, but it didn't really have the capacity for further expansion at the end of the 16th and early 17th century.
And yet the remnants of this collision between the Spanish and Native American cultures in the 15th and 16th centuries still exists today in parts of the United States and the nations of Central and South America.
Okay, so let's go back. Here we are. All right, I'm gonna turn that down because that's killing me. Okay, so a couple of things that they talked about, right? The Spanish and the Portuguese, they colonized for basically the same reasons: wealth, God, glory, and gold. It's usually gold, glory, and God in that order. But as far as types of colonization, which we'll discuss and review again on Thursday, the European nations have different types, and the Spanish and the Portuguese all go under what she talked about in the video as being from the crown. The crown runs it through their emissaries, etc., and they also use the church to help them with that. So they are attempting, and mostly this is Isabel's prompting, Queen of Spain, but to convert Native Americans into Catholicism, and they send Franciscans and Jesuits, priests and monks over to institute the conversion. Now, Jesuits are a special brand. If you know anything about their history, the Jesuits are primarily responsible for the Spanish Inquisition, which is basically a church-sanctioned torture of people in which they take people that say that they've converted to Catholicism, either Muslims or Jews that have become Christians in order to stay in Spain, and basically torture them until they tell them anything they want. The Spanish Inquisition is infamous, right, and gruesome, and run by the Jesuit priests. But that doesn't mean they're all terrible people. And the Franciscans coming over, you have several in which actually write accounts of what's going on, truthful accounts that are not very flattering to the Spanish crown, or the conquistadors. And that in and of itself is dangerous. But the Spanish crown uses these Franciscans to kind of keep a check or rein in their conquistadors who are out conquering in their name. And so there's several very famous conquistadors, right? Fernando Cortez being Hernan Cortez being one of the most famous because of his conquer of the Aztecs. Now, as soon as Columbus lands, he lands on Hispaniola, and he sends word back, "We've made it. I think there's riches here." And how do we know there's gold there? Well, you see people walking around wearing gold jewelry. So they begin kind of going back and forth, this migration, right? And it happens over the next 100 years or so. And this creates something called the Columbian Exchange. And let me pull this up real quick. Now, the Columbian Exchange is just the transfer of goods across the Atlantic and up into Northern Europe as well. But let's see here. Let me pull it up so hopefully I can share my screen with you, give you a good graphic of what I'm talking about. And so, again, they talked about diseases coming over, which was really the primary, that and livestock that the Europeans brought. And this decimates the Native American population. So let me share my screen real quick. And then I'll pull it up. You can see view. All right, so now you can see the graphic of the Columbian Exchange. Of course, you see a lot of these diseases that are going across livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs, horses. And so a lot of the things we think are quintessential Native American, for example, most of us, when we picture Native American, either through art or through movies, they're on horses. But they can't have horses until the Spanish get there because they bring the horses. In addition, Longhorns are from Spain. So something we figure is essentially Texan isn't. It's immigrant. It's an immigrant. It comes from Spain. And the pigs they talked about with diseases as well. And we do bring coffee. Europeans bring coffee to the New World, which takes off because it's very easily grown in Latin America. But what goes back is a lot of food. As you can see, cacao leads to chocolate, potatoes, corn, right? Different animals as well. And one of the only disease that goes from the Americas back to Europe and subsequently Africa as well is syphilis. So some say that's karma in action. You know, if the Spanish hadn't raped or had sex with Native Americans, they never would have gotten syphilis. But to a certain extent, the there were consensual relationships amongst the Native Americans and the Spanish. The Spanish and the Portuguese are more open to that, put it that way, which you will not see in the English. Okay, the French are probably the uh, most likely to actually have a consensual relationship with natives, as well as Spanish and Portuguese. But the English, like I said, are very different, and they are absolutely not. So you see those diseases come over. So when we talk about Cortez and the Aztecs, you see, most people think, well, yes, he conquered them. Excuse me. That's true. But by the time he gets to the Aztec Empire, diseases have ravaged the Aztec Empire. And the Aztecs are going through a rough time at the time. As you know, if you've ever seen Apocalypto, of course, it's probably a decade or so old now. But the Aztecs were a very large civilization in central Mexico. They believed in human sacrifice, and they worshiped the sun god. So a series of things had happened. They'd had a famine for many years. Their crops were failing. They had a solar eclipse, so the sun is blacked out. And if you worship the sun god and the sun goes away, right, this is really devastating to your belief system. So they believe that they've done something wrong, and they begin sacrificing people more than they normally would, and they run out of sacrifices. So they begin kidnapping other tribes around them to fuel the need to sacrifice, because they feel that the sun god needs blood to bring the rains and better take care of their civilization. So while they're doing this, then you have Europeans make contact. They spread diseases. So you've got rival tribes on the outskirts of this big civilization that do not like them, right? That are at war with them. You have famine. You have, their population is decreasing. Then you have disease. You enter disease into this, and it's a recipe for disaster. So by the time Cortez is to the point where he is making war on the Aztecs, they are probably a third of their strength, their normal strength, right? So it's easier for him. And in addition, he's got the technology, right? So some people ask, well, why did Native Americans, any tribe, agree to ally themselves with Europeans when they were so terrible? Because A, they didn't know they were terrible, and B, because Europeans had technology that they didn't. And you see, when you come into North America, these Native American tribes already have very structured civilizations. They're not savages as the Europeans would have you think. They are at war with each other. They have long-standing beef. They go to war with certain tribes. And so when you see Europeans come and they have this new technology such as firearms, horses, steel, swords, armor, it makes sense for you to ally with them so that you can acquire these things and dominate your enemies, right? And it's also economically beneficial to be the only Native American tribe trading with the newcomers, right? Because look at all the things they can trade for. So that's kind of how they get in there. And after the conquer of the Aztecs, all the other conquistadors come and want to, they're looking for another Aztec empire. There is no other one. And of course, the Aztecs, it's all about gold. There was just tons and tons of it. They had mined it. And then, so Pizarro and actually another guy, he teams up with a guy, I want to say his name is DeMarco, lead an expedition to Peru, which is on the other side of South America. And they actually walk across the isthmus. They walk across Panama. And then they go a couple of times. And then the next time they take ships around the bottom of South America. And this is because, they're hearing from Native Americans that there is this huge empire that has silver, that has precious gold, and you should go and trade with them. Now, the Incas, again, are another very intricate civilization. They have a writing system. They have trade routes that go all through Latin America, all through South America. And so when Pizarro encounters them, then it is actually much more decisive. He does not attempt to make peace with them like Cortez did. He does not draw it out. It's almost instantly. As soon as he sees all of this exchange of wealth, he kills their chief, and it's downhill from there. Okay, and like I said, there was a side note to him. He and his partner DeMario or DeMarco fall out, and there is Pizarro kills, or one of Pizarro's family members kills a younger brother of DeMarco. And so DeMarco's family kills Pizarro. They assassinate him. So, there's always drama. History is just a big soap opera. So the Spanish are there. And again, they talked a little bit about virgin soil epidemics. So virgin soil epidemics are exactly what we're going through right now. COVID-19 is a virgin soil epidemic. Nobody has immunity, and there's no vaccine, right? And we haven't seen anything like this yet. It's part of a family of viruses, but COVID is a perfect example of what they call a virgin soil epidemic. And so, in the 15th and 16th centuries, they didn't know. And a lot of those diseases, again, are, as she said, carried by people running away from the sick, not knowing that they were carriers or that they were already infected and that the incubation period hadn't shown yet, it wasn't over yet. So we see that. We also see, again, this spreading of disease through pigs and also biological warfare, right? And that goes all further back into history, but people knew something about you don't want to be around the sick, you don't want to touch the things that the sick have touched, and a lot of this knowledge comes from the Black Death, the plague, but it is documented that Spanish would give Native American tribes blankets from the dead, blankets from people who had died of disease, in order to infect them with disease. So your first forms of biological warfare are there. And the last thing they talk about, right, the Pueblo Revolt of the 1680s. So the Spanish actually explore all through the southwestern part of the United States. And in New Mexico, which is a state, by the way, just to the west of Texas. If you know anything from this class, you will know that New Mexico is a state. I'm from there. That's why it's a big deal to me. But in the state of New Mexico is actually a much bigger territory at the time. The Spanish name every Native American tribe that lives in a certain type of housing Pueblos, even though they're all different tribes. They name them all the same thing, thinking that because they live in the same type of houses, they must be the same tribe, which isn't true, but they call them Pueblos. And the Spanish are being Spanish. They are enslaved Americans. They are forcing them to convert to Catholicism, usually at the end of a sword or the end of a gun. So the Native Americans convert because they don't want to be killed, right? But do they actually convert in their heart? Probably not so much. Give me just 1 second. Come on. It's better. Here you go. There. All right. So in the 1680s, you have probably the only instance of a successful Native American revolt against Europeans. And all the Native Americans in New Mexico that are named the Pueblos by the Spanish get together. They manage to communicate effectively, even though they speak something like 30 different languages, and they get rid of the Spanish. They kick them out. And this is kicked them out for almost 100 years, right? But the Spanish send a famous conquistador by the name of Don Juan de Oñate, and he comes into southern Texas and New Mexico and reconquers it for Spain. Now, what he does to the Pueblo and the Native Americans, he punishes them for what he calls insubordination or treason, and he cuts off their left foot. That was his favorite punishment. He was a barbarian. I mean, he was just terrible. And so what he does is, I mean, he successfully reconquers the area, but he also inflicts, a lot of torture among the people. Now, this kind of brings us to another topic that you're going to see lately. A lot of renaming of statues or tearing down of statues, right? Renaming of things. Have you guys been paying attention to that? Yes, no?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, um, the high school that I went to was named after him. It's named after Oñate. And at the time, I think I remember our senior prank was we cut the left foot off of his statue that was on the campus. So everybody knew, right, that it was named after this pretty barbarous conquistador. Well, now they're talking about changing the name. And not talking about, they voted on it. And the school board says they're going to change the name, but the community is against it. So why? Right? Terrible guy. Why would you be against that? And a lot of this, Alexis, I've already taken Rohan. Um, for the community, it's about money. It's going to cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars to change it. But that kind of brings us to this other idea of, is it important anyway? So is it important that we tear these monuments down and change the names? What do y'all think?
I say yes and no.
I agree.
Give me your yes and give me your no.
I'm gonna say yes just because you know what I mean. You don't want to perpetuate negative a negative history or a negative connotation attached to anything. But I would say no because without these relics, you have no knowledge of where you've been, what you've been through, things like that. So I mean, it's a uneasy reminder, but you know what I mean. It does remind us of what not to, you know, subjugate ourselves to, or you know what I mean.
Okay. Anybody else want to chime in? So there's several arguments to this. Oh, this is teaching us about history. I mean, and I'm not discounting what you said. I'm kind of quoting other people, um, which is true. And some people say, well, I would never have looked up who this person was if I didn't see a statue of them. Uh, and there's some truth to that, but are we glorifying people who fought to create or keep a system of oppression?
I believe so.
Yeah. Um, and I think that's the argument, right? That especially if you have right, and Houston has neighborhoods that are segregated. They're self-segregated now, but a lot of that goes back to history, right? And so is it, should an African American have to live on Robert E. Lee Street, right, or things like that? And so this is just an example, but and it kind of it hits home too, because you're talking about they're renaming this high school, which I'm fine with. Whatever, they can do whatever they want. um, does it change history? No. Does it mean I didn't graduate from that high school? Absolutely not. um, should we glorify somebody who massacred and killed a lot of people, especially in that area? I mean, Native Americans are and still are and very prevalent in the state of New Mexico and Arizona. They have the largest nation of Native Americans is the Navajo, and that's in the Four Corners area. So this is like right in where you see a lot of Native Americans homes, and here you are, right, glorifying this man who massacred people. So I think this kind of goes along with what is our understanding of history, and the conversation between, and you'll hear this a lot too, heritage versus hate or heritage versus history. And history is the good, bad, and the ugly, right? History is everything. Heritage tends to be what people want it to be. Um, and you'll see this with a lot of, especially where we are in the South, you're going to see this with a lot of older Southern white families. They're talking about this was their heritage, the Confederacy, etc. That's fine, but you're also glossing over the system of oppression of slavery, right?
There's actually, in San Antonio, there was a high school named Robert E. Lee, and their mascots were the rebels. And after some time, people actually like complained about it, and the school board listened, and they end up changing the school's name and the mascot. And it was a big fight amongst the black and white community because, and at that school, a majority of the students were black, and the white students that were there felt as if they were erased in American history. So there was kind of like a bit of a racial war slash tension, but finally it changed. So I think it's kind of a good thing.
Yeah. Well, and that's the same thing is happening in my hometown right now. The school board voted to change the name, and they sent out a poll to the community, and the community voted and overwhelmingly wanted to keep the name. But the school board changed it anyway. And the thing was, they didn't suggest another name. They just said, this isn't the name anymore. So you have this high school that's starting up right now, and it has no name. But so there's kind of outcry over that, but it's going to be, it can be based on race, and it can also be based on political persuasion these days. And there's a very large high school in Midland, Texas, named Robert E. Lee. And so it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. My husband is from Midland. He went to Midland High, but he says it'll probably be a cold day and you know where before they change the name of Robert E. Lee in Midland, Texas. But there's that, right? You know, and how does that play into it? The fact that San Antonio is a much more diverse area versus Midland not being. And depending on, because, you know, Midland and Odessa are right in the same area. Is it because it's in Midland and not in Odessa, right? So all those things, those factors kind of come into play there. But, you know, race and history go hand in hand, at least racism and history. So the Spanish and the Portuguese, it's actually the Portuguese, and we're not really going to get into slavery today, but we'll start and set us up for next time. The Portuguese are the first to kind of begin these sugar plantations, and they start with the Canary Islands and the Azores, which are off the western coast of Africa, and they find a shortage of labor, so they begin enslaving Africans and bringing them to these islands, and they create sugar plantations. And if you've ever tried to give up sugar, you know that it's in almost everything. Right? Everything that we like. So sugar is really kind of making the world go round at the time. And whoever controls the sugar trade has the most wealth. And so they're beginning to utilize what they feel is utilized, but they're kidnapping and enslaving native Africans and bringing them to these islands. And so they take that model to the New World. Okay, and whereas the Spanish are first to get there, the Portuguese aren't far behind. But the Portuguese don't land as far north as the Spanish do. They actually land in what's now Brazil, which is why Brazilians speak Portuguese, not Spanish. And all the other nations in Latin America speak Spanish, or most of them. So the Spanish and Portuguese get in an argument over this is mine, go away, finders keepers, right? Although, how do you discover something that there's already people there? But that's a whole nother topic, right? So the Portuguese and the Spanish take it to the Pope. And the Pope says he grants something called the Treaty of Tordesillas. And the Treaty of Tordesillas is basically he draws a line, a latitude line. I will bring it up here and give you a graphic. Here we go. Let me share my screen real quick. My son is over it. All right, so here is the Treaty of Tordesillas. And so what the Pope says is the Spanish get everything to the west of that line, and the Portuguese get everything to the east of that longitude line. Okay, so Pope Alexander VI is more, as you can tell, predisposed to the Spanish. Again, he is favoring Isabel and Anne Ferdinand. He has given Isabel the title of most Catholic sovereign, right? But he still gives Portugal this part. And Portugal just decides that, well, this means all of that, all of Brazil. And so both of them are exploring in the New World, specifically Latin America, Mesoamerica, and Middle America. And North America. But so they begin talking about this. Now, again, the Portuguese are the ones that begin the slave trade. And they have kind of monopolized the western coast of Africa already. They have trading posts all down the western coast. So they begin that. The Spanish are trading with the Portuguese. And then again, they begin trading the Africans directly along the western coast of Africa. And what's really important is that we discuss, like, what is slavery. In American history classes, and for most Americans, when you say slavery, they think American South enslaved Africans, right? But slavery has been around since the beginning of time. And you see it in the Bible. There's slavery in the Bible. There's slavery in all internationally throughout the world since, like I said, the beginning of time. Now, but the thing is that slavery is not the same everywhere. Native Americans had slavery. We think of what we think of is chattel slavery, CHATTLE, chattel slavery. And that is different. It has very specific characteristics. It is a lifelong indenture. I shouldn't use that word, but it is lifelong. It is inherited. It is brutal. It is particular to the Americas, right? And it's specifically refers to Africans who were kidnapped and enslaved and taken across the Atlantic. You'll also hear it called the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, but there's other terms and things, and I'm hearing this come out now. They're talking about, well, the Irish were enslaved too, to a certain extent, but that's different. They had indentured servitude. Indentured servants are not slaves. They never have been. Okay, indentured servants are people who sell themselves into slavery. It's kind of like slavery, but servitude for a number of years. It's through a contract. At the end of that term, they are released. Okay, so it's not slavery. They're not born into it. Sometimes they get kidnapped and put into it, but it is not a lifelong. They don't pass it on to their children. There's usually a term in which it expires. Okay, so that's different. Slavery amongst Native American peoples are usually they capture the losers of a battle, right? The other tribe, they take them into their tribe. They call them slaves. Usually they are set free. They're taken into their families. They're not treated inhumanely. They're just treated as POWs, right? Prisoners of war. You have slavery in other parts of the world. So it's important that we understand, especially when you're talking about today in this climate, this political climate, and the world, that you're going to have people who are going to attempt to diminish the brutality or the sheer volume of the transatlantic slave trade with the idea that there was slavery in other places. Okay, and you'll hear this, they had it just as bad. No, they did not. And slavery, again, is just kind of a blanket term. Now, what we're going to begin talking about on Thursday is the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery. Okay? You guys have any questions? It's 11:10. It's time to sign off. Hit the chat button or just ask your question. And otherwise, I've got you on the chat. And have a nice day. We'll see you Thursday. If they change it because of the hurricane coming, I'll let you know.